Hello friends, for today's video I want to give a list of recommendations for if you like Arcane, you might like these stories as well. Before I jump into my recommendations, if you have any of your own, feel free to leave those in the comments because one, selfishly, I love Arcane. I wouldn't mind seeing your suggestions. Anything that has even remotely some parallels to Arcane, instantly my interest is piqued. But second, and more importantly, for anybody that comes to this video, I want them to have not just the things that I'm going to be recommending, but your suggestions as well, so that there's as many suggestions as possible. And additionally, if there's any overlap between what I mention and what you mention, I think that just further solidifies that that is something that a lot of people see some kind of connection with. If you are interested in anything I end up mentioning, I'll have all of the information for everything in the description bar in the order that I go through these, so it's as easy to navigate as possible. And if you feel like you have some of your interest piqued after hearing about these, but you want to hear more about them, any reviews I've done, I'll have as well. I am primarily going to be sticking to book recommendations. I'll have a couple of other mediums mixed in, but kicking it off and actually starting with the thing that I feel like you have to say if you want to, well, you don't have to if you haven't read it, but if you have, I feel like this is the most obvious thing to mention, and that would be Ruination. Interestingly, despite the fact that this is also in the League of Legends world, I don't necessarily think that the parallels between this and Arcane are as strong as some of the other stories I'm going to mention today. However, it does take place in the same world. The reason I say that there aren't necessarily the strongest of parallels is because it doesn't actually follow any of our characters from Arcane. It doesn't follow side characters from Arcane. You're not even really looking at Piltover and Zaun. You are exploring a completely different area and you're kind of getting a much more magical story. So if you would say interest in certain parts of Arcane was really present, but you felt like you didn't quite get enough, or you barely touched the surface and you wish you could explore the Arcane more, you wish you could explore the magic of this world more, you are going to see that be a lot more present here. This feels much more like classic fantasy, sword and sorcery, adventure type of story, except the thing I will say I think ties it to League of Legends really well is the fact that you still, despite having a more plot-driven and world-building-driven story, have interesting characters, and specifically interesting character relationship and development. So the setup for the story is you have this young man who has attained power, and he has a very tenuous hold on everything, but he's doing the best he can. And he has a woman that he is in love with, and this woman has something happen where she is now on the brink of death. So this enters in what I would say is your main protagonist of the story, somebody who cares deeply about both of them and wants to do everything she can to not only help them from a personal level, but also to try and ensure that power is maintained peacefully. So she goes on what feels like this impossible quest to see if she can find some means of curing the woman who is ill. It is through this quest that you explore the magic, you explore politics, you explore this forbidden, magical, mysterious city, and I felt like all of that was just so fun and interesting. This is a standalone, so it's just one story and it's complete, but it definitely has stakes that get further and further increased the more into the story you go. I was actually taken kind of by surprise. There is one of the video games. I'm not going to mention the video games as a recommendation today because I'm pretty sure most people are aware that Arcane is from the League of Legends video game world. However, there is a game where the opening cutscene is essentially following this very plot line that I'm describing from this book. So that was kind of cool. That's a fun parallel to see it play out on the screen. But it doesn't play out on the screen through Arcane in any fashion, it just takes place in the same world. Because so many of us, I think, are aware that while Arcane has ended, we are going to be exploring other areas of the League of Legends world, I think that just makes this story that much more fulfilling, because it feels like eventually we're going to get every little pocket, and we're going to explore all these side characters, and we're going to see the way certain sects are mingling in the politics of other places. Maybe we're going to get more lore, and I think that this book is going to become more of a prevalent recommendation the more from this studio that we get. At the time I'm filming this, right around this time, we will also be getting an Ambessa novel. While I haven't read it just yet because it's not out at the moment, it will be out very soon, and as such, I think that also, if you didn't know that exists, definitely probably want to put that one on your radar. Moving away though from those very obvious recommendations, all of the rest are going to fall into some kind of umbrella as to what connects them to Arcane, because people come to Arcane and love it for different reasons. And so I wanted to explore all those various different reasons through the recommendations. We have complex sibling relationships, really great mental health representation, as well as there being kind of an exploration into why people are the way they are. We also have stories that have slightly different worlds from what you typically think of when you think of fantasy, as well as just class differences and insurmountable odds. There are definitely going to be some stories where there's overlap between not only just maybe two of the categories, but several of them, but I tried to place them where I felt like they most comfortably fit. We'll go ahead and kick it off though with there being class differences. This is an aspect of Arcane that, despite the fact that I love these characters, the individuality of them and exploring what makes them tick, what makes them the way they are, you do kind of span a lot of time throughout the story so you can truly understand these individuals, and even then you crave more. Despite all those things, part of why the character development is so great and understanding their motivations is so easy for us to connect to is in part because the world itself and what all these characters are up against and their environment so well plays a role in the story. So I think that the ones that we're going to talk about here also have that presence. So the three that we're going to be mentioning for this category would be Mistborn, Fireborne, and Red Rising. Red Rising has the most obvious class differences between various groups of people, as their society is literally broken up by class, specifically through color. At the beginning of the story, you are following a young man who is part of the Reds. They are pretty much at the bottom of the class distinctions. And Reds are groups that are physically weaker, smaller. They primarily stick to working in these horrible conditions within the mines, which actually that is a little parallel between it and Arcane. You hear about these characters talk about working in the mines and how difficult everything was. So there is that feeling of almost like you're following somebody from a different time period within Arcane. But regardless, this character ends up, his name is Darrow, having the ability to infiltrate the golds, who are the people that are at the very top. And in doing so, he has to undergo a lot of physical transformations so that he blends in with them. And he is going to try to break the color system down from the inside. We don't necessarily have a character who infiltrates quite in the same way as Darrow in this story, but I do think if you like stories that explore the complexities of these caste systems and these distinctions between people that feel so insignificant, but yet their entire infrastructure is developed off of the backs of a certain group, and then it's the people at the top that get to benefit from all those things. If you like exploring stories that do that, this one I think does it really well. I will say this is sci-fi. You don't really have fantastical elements. I definitely think that Arcane fits better within the sci-fantasy or maybe even steampunk type of setting. But regardless, if this is a type of story that you like to explore, if you like these sorts of themes, there's a chance that you'll enjoy Red Rising. Before we even got season 2 of Arcane, I saw a lot of people making connections between Mistborn and Arcane. I do think that the magic systems are extremely different from each other, and I don't necessarily think that our protagonist in this and her mentor figure necessarily have direct correlations between the characters of Arcane. However, I do think that the world and the way it's set up has some mirroring to Arcane. So what I was describing with Red Rising of there being this caste system based off of colors, with Mistborn, you have basically just people at the top and people at the bottom. There really are only two. And rather than have distinctions with the city itself, you have a distinction between how everybody is treated, what they can attain in life, and their roles. So you have the Ska and the nobility, and that's basically it. You do have one individual known as the Lord Ruler who rules over everyone, and they're seen as almost like this godlike figure because as far as everybody knows, this individual saved the world from ruination, no pun intended, years and years ago, and thus, when they took the power against evil, they righted the world and they made everything as it should be. So there are a lot of people that are content, and understandably, a lot of those people are the ones that are nobility, and they believe what they have been told about the Ska. However, our main character named Vin is somebody who was born a Ska, and she has certain abilities that seem like they shouldn't belong to her. She always just kind of chalked it up to being luck. But a mentor individual ends up showing up named Kelsier, who recognizes in Vin what actually her luck is rooted in, and that has to do with their magic system. And from there, he takes Vin under his wing, and they do what they can to try to break the system down. So there's a lot of parallels, I would say, not just in the fact that you have two groups of people that are treated very different within society, but also, while I don't think Vin and Vi are necessarily similar in their personalities, I do think that both of them are very willing to do a lot of difficult things and make very, very difficult choices to try and do what they think is best. And also they have experienced truly what it is to be at the bottom, to be treated different. So when they enter certain areas and they feel like they're entering a completely different world from their own by, in Vin's case, going into the nobility, or in Vi's case, interacting with people from Piltover, these characters have to navigate what feels like an entirely different world. I will say as well that while I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't want to give away any spoilers, there are some parallels between the character Vin and a character Elend and Vi and Caitlin. But that's all I'll say about that. And then last for this category, we have the Aurelian Cycle, the first book being Fireborne. The first two I mentioned, while Red Rising at times in the past, it's kind of gone back and forth among readers of whether it's YA or adult. The series, as it progresses, becomes very adult. Mistborn, similar things. I would say there's a lot about it that has made it so it can be sold in the young adult section, but once again, there are some aspects to it, especially the complexities of the magic system and the lore, that feels more like it's adult fantasy. This series is formally considered young adult, which I think for some people they think, oh, maybe I've grown out of young adult, not really my thing. I think the way the information's delivered is maybe, at the end of the day, I'm not the target audience, so perhaps it's not really for me. But I think that the way in which Rosaria Munda captures the themes within this story are so fantastically done that it sort of transcends age range, in my opinion. So the setup for this story is that you have these two individuals that are basically from, like what we talked about with Mistborn, it's almost as if they're from different worlds, because one of them was born into nobility and the other was born in poverty. They were a peasant. And there was actually a rebellion that already happened. So the distinction between classes has been broken down, and this rebellion was successful, but as a result, it left both our main characters, Annie and Lee, as orphans. They met each other in an orphanage, and because they met each other somewhat, you could say, from a level playing field, they just knew each other as children who had endured hardship. And then within this new world that's supposed to be better than the previous one because everybody's equal now, they have the opportunity to become dragon riders. Annie, however, very much sees that despite the fact that supposedly society has made it so everyone is equal, she is definitely still treated very differently than some of her peers. And Lee just seems to have this magnetism, and he just seems to get everything he's meant to have, despite the fact that nobody knows his true identity. I kind of compare it oftentimes to Anastasia, where people don't really know that he was a part of the previous ruling class, and also he has to keep this a secret, as if anybody knew, chances are they would kill him. But everything starts to have this sort of awakening when the characters are realizing that maybe everybody isn't as equal as you might expect, and the previous ruling class, the survivors of that class, want to prove that this new society isn't as good as everybody thinks. I do think what makes this somewhat similar to Arcane, not necessarily the characters so much, although once again, you can maybe see some parallels between the fact that you have these characters that come from different sides, one being from Zon, one being from Piltover, in this case, one being from a peasant class and one being from a ruling class. Despite the parallels there, I do very much think that any kind of commentary on societies and political structures and ruling classes and how we try and attain equality and the complexities of that, the faults within different governing bodies and different systems, I do feel like there are such difficult decisions to be made, especially how it gets placed on young people who are supposed to be the ones taking up the mantle and ruling next, or doing what they can, not necessarily maybe ruling formally, as they don't really call it that, but trying to maintain peace. And I would say some of those things are truer within season 2 of Arcane, where you're exploring certain characters and their efforts to maintain peace, feeling like they're being pulled between these impossible extremes, and they don't really know what to do, and it feels as though any decision they make is the wrong one, or maybe even morally incorrect. Like, they just don't feel like there's a right answer that is going to serve everybody. All those sorts of questions, I think, are done fantastically. Next up, I wanted to explore the category of mental health and moral grayness with characters and redemption arcs. One of the things I'm mentioning has other parallels that I can't really say for spoiler reasons, but when you start the other story, if you do, it's not going to feel similar at all. It's not going to be similar at all. I really want to ensure that you go in with correct expectations, but I promise that By the time you get to the end, you will see why I'm saying there are additional parallels besides just the category that this falls into. So I'll go ahead and say the story. It would be Attack on Titan. I love Attack on Titan. But there's a particular redemption arc that I do think is done with such a level of care, and I can't recall feeling so back and forth on a character possibly ever. I mean, you really engage with this character in a way where you want to believe that they are a victim in some way, that they don't want to be doing the things that they're doing, that they're misled, that they're misunderstood, the more that you are finding out about what is going on. And then when you really see certain scenes, you feel betrayed and you hate them and you think there is no coming back from this. Perhaps you also explore coming back from that, and it's such a whirlwind of emotions. So I can't say that character's name because of, once again, spoiler reasons. I do not want to clue you in whatsoever as to who I might be talking about, because if you check out Attack on Titan and you haven't in the past, trust me when I say it is very much a good thing to not know things going in. But we can talk about some parallels to a certain character from Arcane, who would be Jinx. Jinx is a character I think has always been very likable. Even when they're making decisions that you perhaps don't necessarily entirely agree with, you still find yourself wanting to stick up for them. Even when they harm other people, you're like, well, but, and you really try to justify their actions, even if you know deep down certain things perhaps have crossed certain lines. I do think that Jinx maintains that level of the person engaging with the story always wants to side with her, which is a little different than the character from Attack on Titan. But regardless, they really do have some heartbreaking moments when they reflect, when they see what they could be and what could have been, and they're trying to right certain wrongs, they're trying to be a better person. They care about other people, they're starting to care about other people differently than they ever did before. And then when they feel like they've lost everything and all of it was pointless and hopeless, they have certain moments that also additionally mirror the moments that this character I'm referring to in Attack on Titan have. I mean, there's certain scenes that, while not necessarily exactly the same, they have very similar motives and intents, and watching those scenes is devastating for both of the characters. So I am so apologetic that I can't tell you a little bit more about these individual characters because I don't want to ruin that, and I'm so sorry that I'm having to be kind of vague about whatever this other mysterious parallel is, but trust me, you don't want to know exactly. Just know that there are some very interesting parallels that are unexpected and that really make you question. I do want to also note that the whole concept of having insurmountable odds, 100% Attack on Titan probably fits that better than anything, because so many times you're like, okay, everybody just keeps dying. When are we ever going to have a win? But keeping with the mental health and the motivation aspect of things, understanding the characters, their redemption arcs, those sorts of things. The other two I wanted to mention for this category would be Strange the Dreamer and the Stormlight Archive. Strange the Dreamer, I would say, has a level of creativity that I don't see from much else, as far as it feels like nothing else exactly, which is great. There are pieces of it that obviously, like today, make it so that I'm recommending it in reference to something else, but those are always pieces. In its entirety, it's not really like anything else. The parallel I'm drawing between it and with Arcane happens to come through the fact that you really, once again, explore certain characters and you get to the bottom of why they are the way they are. When you start Strange the Dreamer, you are following a young man named Laszlo Strange, who has the opportunity to find out if this one mythical place is actually real. And he's been obsessed with this place his whole life. He does believe it's real, so this is like a dream come true for him. So he decides he's going to embark on this journey to discover if this place is real. And then you are introduced to some other characters who are blue and mysterious, and you don't really know what's going on with them. It is with their party, that second group of people, that you are having a character that I wanted to focus on, and that character would be Minya. This character, okay, unlike Jinx, who, as I was saying, you pretty much always, in some fashion, like Jinx. Minya, you can't stand. They just feel so rotten and uncaring, and like they just root for everybody else to be miserable, and you don't understand. They're not necessarily a villain. They're not the reason for the various different hardships that everybody has to endure. They're just that character that you're like, oh my gosh, I hate them, and you almost borderline like them less than some characters that feel more notably villainous. There are other characters I feel that you can point to within Strange the Dreamer that represent this too, but Minya really at her core just seems rotten. And then over the course of this duology, that's only 2 books, you start to kind of turn the clock back and explore what makes Minya the way she is. I remember when I read Strange the Dreamer, people were saying, I know you don't like Minya, you just need to read some more about Minya though. And I thought, there's no way that I'm going to have my mind changed about this character. I can't stand them. They're just so awful. And then you see some things that they went through and you're like, oh, okay, I understand now. I just really appreciate when stories can do that. And so much of Strange the Dreamer is about trying to go across that void that feels like is impossible to have a bridge between. It feels like so many times there are these things that make us divided and separate us from each other. And within other fantasy stories, I feel like the difference is you end up having these epic battles and it's us against them. And there's more so, even though I think we are getting in a place where we do explore the reasons why the other side is the way they are, I still think that there's a lot of fantasy that's about having some kind of fight between these characters and somebody has to win, somebody has to be the good guy, and you have to have somebody to root for and somebody to hate. And in this story, it's about having compassion, having empathy, trying to see why the other side is the way they are and reach across even when it might cost you, even when you have to, it feels like sacrifice so much to do this. And I do actually think that Arcane does that really well with so many of its characters. There are certain characters where, sure, it feels like they're on opposite sides, but it's just that wanting to understand and to reach across and see somebody for who they are. And then also, even if you can't, somebody else can. Somebody else cares about that person that is supposedly your enemy. And when you see that, you have to wonder, is there more to that person than whatever it is that makes me dislike them or hate them? And I think Strange the Dreamer does that exceptionally. With the Stormlight Archive, there are so many great character development moments throughout this series. I would say it's specifically the way that we spend so much time exploring the mental health of the characters and their trauma. The characters themselves, while yes, there are characters that experience being at the bottom of a society, being mistreated and having to rise up, specifically the character Kaladin, I think really represents that well. I would say the world and the politics are quite different. You might be able to make some parallels between the fact that there are these high princes in this country within this huge world and maybe the Council of Arcane. And yes, they have some technological advancements. It is somewhat of a sci fantasy story, but it by no means feels steampunk. I wouldn't say that the class differences between the light eyes and the dark eyes in this exactly feels like the class differences between Piltover and Zon, but there are definitely some parallels there. But I really feel it's the very, very heavy character work that we do in Stormlight Archive that I wanted to draw comparisons to, because I can't think of too many other stories that really take the time, especially for certain kinds of things that people can experience that we don't see as often. I do think we are starting to see depression and anxiety so much more often, but the character Shallan, what she has going on with her, and also exploring what's going on with Jinx in Arcane, I don't necessarily feel like those are things that we typically explore, or at least maybe if we do, we barely scratch the surface. And the creators of both of these stories, they do more than just scratch the surface. The next category would be complex sibling relationships. I have 3 for this, and we have Fullmetal Alchemist, Crown of Feathers, and City of Brass. City of Brass and Crown of Feathers, hardly at all, aside from the complex sibling relationships, are they related to Arcane. But I still think that that's an element that some people really enjoy about Arcane, and I wanted to make sure I have some recommendations if that's one of the things that you like. But I do think that Fullmetal Alchemist has parallels beyond that, specifically with its world, with the level of there being like these corrupt individuals who have, it feels like, their hands in everything, this sort of balance between magic and technology, and the fact that it seems as though like there's this other kind of magic, or maybe there's more to the magic than you realize, and it comes from some other place, and then once it starts to sort of almost infiltrate your area and how all that comes together, I definitely think there are more than just the siblings within this and the siblings with Arcane to find connections between. The world also literally feels a little bit more like Arcane's in its level of technological advancements. However, all that to say, Edward and Alphonse, while not against each other basically at all, I do feel like they have to really examine so much of what they've been through and their roles with each other, both as the younger sibling and the older sibling. That is part of what makes this story so incredibly moving. It's also so funny. I love Fullmetal Alchemist, so many of you know. I mean, any opportunity I have. And yes, indeed, I will also be mentioning Final Fantasy today because I just feel like these stories are great and I want to recommend them all the time. And I will find parallels between them and a lot of other things because there's so much to these stories that make them great. But regardless, if you don't know the setup for Fullmetal Alchemist, you follow these two young boys who, when they were very young, their mother ended up passing away and they tried to bring her back to life using alchemy. This went terribly wrong. One brother lost an arm and a leg, and the other brother lost his entire body, and his soul had to be attached to a suit of armor. Now these two brothers are doing everything they can to try and get their original bodies back, which launches them into this whole story that reaches heights that you would not expect, with the stakes, with the level of corruption, with a huge cast of characters beyond just the two of them. The way that these two brothers are by each other's sides and stick with each other despite everything that is thrown at them, that I think makes this really beautiful. But I do think that even its origin, even the beginning of Edward and Alphonse's story, has some parallels to what you see with Jinx and Vi. You have these two characters who endured incredible hardship as little children. And then you see Vi doing everything she can to be the perfect older sister, but then in some ways she has to be like the parent as well. And they do have a mentor figure. In Arcane, obviously, you see that they have a father figure of sorts who is taking care of them, but they still get into trouble. They still do things that maybe are in some ways rooted in the fact that the older sibling is trying so hard to be a parent, even though they're a kid themselves. And you also have a mentor-like figure for Edward and Alphonse who enters the picture, and you see a little bit more with them. So you have some parallels in how their stories start. I do think that these characters are very different. Alphonse is the biggest sweetheart in the world, so he's not like Jinx at all. And Edward is kind of a loose cannon of a character and is really off the walls pretty often. And while Vi is somebody who is a great fighter and everything, I'd say she's a little more stoic and suave than Edward. I don't think anybody ever would use the word suave to describe Edward at all.
So we meet again, you little bastard. I'm not gonna drink you.
But Edward, this burden he feels on his shoulders, which he wouldn't categorize it as a burden, but what you can see being just impossibilities placed on his shoulders, that is definitely true of Vi as well. They feel so much pressure, and then the younger siblings, they just want to be there for them, but this in some ways creates tension, and I really appreciate the way both of these stories navigate the complexities of these sibling relationships. And that's a story that you can check out the manga or you can watch the anime. Both are great, both are really funny, both are really heartbreaking, and both have amazing, amazing worlds. And then we have City of Brass. This is a story that originally starts out as historical fiction and then very quickly becomes fantasy. You are looking at a young woman named Nahri in Cairo. She ends up basically accidentally summoning a djinn, and this ends up launching her into this world she didn't even know existed. She ends up going to the City of Brass, which is the city of the djinn, and getting caught up in all of their politics and the inner workings of their class differences and why they have so much hatred between certain groups. And she doesn't really know anything. She's thrown in the middle of it, and supposedly she is also a very important individual for their world, and she doesn't really understand how. And through her interactions with the ruling class, she ends up being introduced to a young man named Ali Zaid, as well as a few other individuals. And it's Ali Zaid and his brother Muntadir is where I'm drawing the comparisons. Muntadir is not the best older brother whatsoever. I feel like Ali Zaid is doing everything he can to try and understand people for who they are, and you find yourself disliking Muntadir because you really understand where Ali Zaid is coming from, but he's just in the most impossible of circumstances, and it almost feels like Muntadir is careless, and he can afford to be careless because he doesn't have as much weight on his shoulders. But then you see in his own way, he's trying to also do what's best for his family, for society, and it's just ripping him apart, but you wouldn't know it because of how he presents himself. So I do think the way that these characters end up being on the same side and then being on opposing sides and then are at each other's throats and then care about each other and almost don't want to care about each other because it gets in the way of certain other things, that's definitely present in many instances with Vi and Jinx. And then last, for the complex relationships between siblings, like I said, we have Crown of Feathers. This one is much more a matter of, I don't know if these two siblings should have a relationship, which, as much as I like to think of Vi and Jinx more in the way that I was just describing the characters from City of Brass and Fullmetal Alchemist, there are times where you question whether they even should have a relationship with each other, because it just feels as though they're constantly at each other's throats, that they constantly are actually causing harm to each other, even when they're trying to do right by each other, and it just feels like sometimes they can get in the way. And I love Vi. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that everything is Vi's fault and everything would have been perfect if only Vi had just left Jinx alone and let Silco just be the only person she had a connection with. I'm always like, I don't subscribe to that idea. But if you do, if you are that person that's like, no, I see Vi as the villain, you might enjoy Crown of Feathers. The setup for this story is you have these two sisters who are essentially on their own from an early age, and they're doing everything they can to make a phoenix egg hatch. You can pretty quickly identify that the older sister is relatively unkind to the younger sister. She seems to go about her behavior like she has to do this. She has to toughen the younger sister up for the way that the world actually is. She just doesn't understand. She's naive. And this is how the older sister treats her. But the younger sister is very sweet, and she is trying to do what she can to just be a good person in a difficult world. But early on in the story, something happens that just pushes her over the edge, and she decides, you know what? I'm done being treated this way. I'm going to try and venture out on my own. She ends up allying herself with some Phoenix riders, and there are a lot more things going on with the lore and the history of why certain groups seem to be at odds with each other and whether the Phoenix riders are good or bad, and there being these rebellions, former queens that have died, and it seems like there was a power vacuum. So there's a lot more to it than just these two sisters and phoenixes. But if, like I said, if you feel as though Vi is villainous in a sense, and you just wish she would get out of the way so the younger sister could thrive, you might enjoy the trilogy. I mentioned a bit ago that yes, indeed, I was going to be recommending Final Fantasy at some point. So I have two Final Fantasy recommendations. I'm just gonna get these out of the way. I'm gonna start with Final Fantasy XII, as I actually think the world of Final Fantasy XII is in a lot of ways kind of similar to what you see with Arcane. I think that the way that technology plays a role, there being like these airships, there are certain scenes even from Arcane, and the way they capture the world, and the fact that you have this young individual looking out at Piltover and seeing the airships and thinking, I'm going to ride on one of those someday. I think there are some similarities there between Vaughn and Penelo and how they look at everything. I just think that you don't necessarily have the exact same kinds of plot lines throughout the course of Final Fantasy XII. And I also think that the quote-unquote main characters of Final Fantasy XII that you start out with, the ones I just mentioned, Vaughn and Penelo, Vaughn is no one's favorite. Balthier is really cool. Ash is really cool. You sort of have there's this lost heir sort of plot line within Final Fantasy XII that you don't really have at Arcane, but the world itself, you could very easily see the parallels of how these worlds are. So I think if you're somebody who likes the idea of there being this magic that feels scientific in a sense, and there being people at the top that are trying to use it, and then people who live at the bottom who sort of look in awe at what the other groups have, but then also sort of resent them for it, there are definitely some parallels there. With Final Fantasy X, there's so much about Final Fantasy X. I think that this was one of the first stories I ever encountered that I just found myself filled with wonder over in every direction, from the different races of people that are fantasy races that you've never seen before, to the different kinds of creatures that exist, the world itself. It just feels so lived in and real, and like there's history, but you have just enough of the story to understand, and then you're captivated by the characters. You're not just captivated by one, but this full cast of characters. They have what feels like the insurmountable odds, which we've talked about a little bit here and there, and you just find that there's just every little piece of the story that you can get into. There's something that you can dig your teeth into. Nothing is surface level. Everything has depth to it. And I love it so, so much. So there's like all these little pieces that make it so that if you like one, you might like the other. As I said, Final Fantasy XII has, I think, more obvious parallels, but there's just something about that sense of wonder and excitement for this sci fantasy story that I think both Arcane and Final Fantasy X possess. I'm not entirely sure what to call this next category. It's one of the few that I'm like, Victor Jace parallels or the Council parallels. So the first one we have would be Vicious and Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. Fingers crossed. I know this author is working on a third book in this series, so hopefully we will get that at some point. But regardless, there is a sense of Victor and Jace working together for what they hope to be the betterment of society. But they do have their own personal motivations for why they do what they do, and that sometimes clouds their judgment. I certainly think that if you took that concept and you turned it up and it went to the nth degree, you would have these characters. These are also less likable from a place of like, oh, well, I can see where they're trying to do good, even if sometimes they make decisions I don't agree with. That's not these characters in Vicious. These characters are just kind of selfish, but you can't help but get sucked into watching them. And the idea is that you have these two young men who are brilliant minds, similar to Victor and Jace, who are experimenting with the concept of extraordinaries. EOs is what the world refers to them as. And this is not a known thing. It's just almost like a conspiracy theory. The idea being if somebody dies, but then quickly comes back to life, that they will then have some kind of power, and that power is in some way related to how they died temporarily. And these two young men realize that if they really want to understand if this concept is real or not, they may have to take some pretty extreme measures to find out. When they do this, something goes awry that completely shatters their relationship, and now these two young men want to kill each other. And that's where you start the story, is them wanting to kill each other, and you realize that they had some kind of friendship in the past, that they worked together, then something went wrong, but you don't know what, and you explore that through a fractured timeline as it all comes together. This is much moodier and almost more sinister, I would say, than what you see with Jace and Victor over the course of Arcane's 2 seasons, but I definitely think this sort of experimental thing that you have between these two brilliant individuals, and then that pulling them together and then pushing them apart, and them thinking they're doing something interesting and that will help people, but in actuality they're maybe more selfishly motivated than they realize, or they're easily manipulated. And there is an element of with Jace and Victor, let's just say there's an element to their relationship that has created a lot of fan art. That's how I'm gonna word it. And in Eli's case in this story, Eli, and is his name Victor in this? Victor, the characters, I was like, wait, yeah, Victor and Eli in this. There is a level of like they hate each other, but like, did they once maybe perhaps feel tension for different reasons? Who's to say? Another one of my favorites, probably my favorite fantasy standalone of all time, it's a recent read for me and I loved it so much, would be Blood Over Brighthaven. This, to me, is like exploring the council and then discovering that the council is not as good as you thought. I also think there are parallels between the world and the magic system within Blood Over Brighthaven and Arcane. The setup is that you follow this young woman named Sayana who has a lot going against her in the fact that her society definitely really tries to keep women in certain roles, and she's a brilliant mind who wants to do what she can to make the world a better place, and she has to push past a lot of the sexism that she faces in order to try and solidify herself not only as a brilliant mind to work to make their society better, but also to kind of go down in the history books. And she, in a similar way to Victor from Arcane, she has motives that are somewhat rooted in making the world a better place. And with her specifically, it's trying to show that there's a lot that women have to offer, but at the same time, maybe she has some of her own motivations as well that aren't necessarily as noble as she was convincing herself they were. And you also are actually seeing the discrepancies within society, and that's where I think you are also going to see parallels between this and the Zahn Piltover dynamic. Additionally, the other people who have power within Blood Over Brighthaven, they feel in some ways like the council. Like, they recognize that we're going to the public, present something we're doing as really fantastic. We're making the city safer. We're expanding the city. We're going to do so much. But really, they're just profiting for themselves. They're just making themselves look better. And yes, some other people will benefit, but it's never the people at the bottom whose lives are going to get better. And at some point, our main character is realizing that everything she thought she knew maybe isn't exactly what she expected. And then from there, you start to really see a lot of growth. They're a pretty insufferable character for a while. I feel like Victor, you really love Victor, and then at some point you're like, Victor, no, with certain decisions. And this character, you're more like, wow, this woman is kind of insufferable. And then as the story progresses, you're like, come on, you're so close to understanding and learning and having a moment, an aha moment. And if you could just really capitalize on that, you might have some growth. So I feel like it's sort of a reverse in a sense, although Victor was never insufferable for me, but there are a lot of aspects of Blood Over Brighthaven, I think, that have connections outside of some of the parallels I mentioned, but part of the fun of that story is getting to see all the ways that everything plays out, so I don't want to say too much else. The last formal category is going to be that there are things about the world itself that feel similar, things that are more steampunk-esque, or maybe certain aspects to how society functions. There's some parallels there, but there's one book that I can't really find a specific spot for it. And I'm just going to say that there's a character that has some parallels to a character from Arcane, and also maybe there are some relationship aspects where there are parallels as well, and that would be Gideon the Ninth. This is a sci fantasy space sort of haunted, not quite haunted house, but almost like you're trapped in this area and no one can leave until they figure out what's going on and how they're supposed to make something work, and people are dying, and it's like a hybrid of so many things. It's kind of hard to describe. It's almost thriller-like, it's sci-fi-like, it's fantasy-like, there's necromancy. It's a whole mix of things that makes it a very unique reading experience, and it's also both posh and stupid. It's a fun mix of both those things, I would say, where at times the descriptions can feel very lush and well-written and poetic almost, and then there will be a dumb joke mixed in, and like the dumbest of dumb jokes. And it was a balance that I greatly enjoyed. The reason I'm comparing it to Arcane, despite the many differences, would be the main character. Gideon, in so many ways, reminds me of Vi in how she's described. I think that Gideon has accepted, and probably is, a certain level of intelligence that I don't know that is exactly the same as Vi. I mean, Vi is kind of that brawler character, but I don't think I look at Vi and think like, oh, she's so dumb. Maybe some of you do, which makes me sad. But I don't think Vi comes across dim-witted by any means. I think the character Gideon is very much like, I'm just the muscles and aren't they nice? And I do find her character to be quite funny. But there are other aspects of their characters that I don't want to reveal too much of. But there's other aspects of their characters and their relationships with another individual that I would say there are some similarities with. I definitely think if you like Vi and another character, you'll probably enjoy Gideon the Ninth. Now on to what is going to be the category with the most recommendations. We have parallels with the world. A couple of these, it really is just, this is more of a steampunk story, and some of them, it goes a little bit beyond that. So for the ones where there aren't too many other details, I'll just very quickly say these ones have somewhat similar worlds, but the rest of the story is different. But for the ones that do have more parallels, I'll go a little bit more into specifics. And I'll say that's true of the first one, which would be Spark of the Everflame. Personality-wise, I don't think that this character necessarily has anything in common with Vi from Arcane. However, so many of the struggles that she has are related. So you have a character who, early on in the story, something happened to her mother. And as a result, you see this character doing everything she can to be a parental figure and a sister to her younger sibling. Her younger sibling, and this is her brother, but you do see that she wants to do whatever she has to so that her younger brother can have some level of comfort in his life, that his life doesn't have to change too much despite the fact that the family dynamic is completely shattered. You also have an individual who is looking after her and her sibling, and they kind of fulfill the role of a father figure, so you have that parallel as well. And then you have a society that is broken up into two distinct groups, and this character ends up having the opportunity to get to know those at the top a little bit better through her job, her profession. They not only have more in the way of wealth, but they seem to have more access to things like magic that allows for them to maintain their place at the top. We have Six of Crows. I will say, I think that while there are some magic users in Six of Crows, it just feels so much more like you're following crime lords and you're following these various different gangs, and you do get to really understand the characters at a level that I feel is somewhat on par with what you see in Arcane, so I do appreciate that aspect quite a bit. I also think the character relationships, while not always the same as what you get in Arcane, I think the level to which Lee Bardugo goes to explore these characters and their relationships with each other, I do feel like if you enjoy that in Arcane, you'll potentially quite like it in Six of Crows. But I also just think in general, the world, there just is like this griminess to Zaun, and there's definitely a griminess to the city within Six of Crows, and you have these characters that are way older in their behavior than they actually are in age, just trying to make do. And I kind of feel like Kaz Brekker has some Silco vibes a little bit to him, like a young Silco, just trying to do what he can to get whatever he wants from any given situation and trying to come out on top. His cool, calm, collected demeanor, and they even have similar looks in how they're described. So we haven't had too many Silco comparisons, but I do think that Kaz Brekker and Silco, there's some similarities between these two. Next up we have of Jade and Dragons. This story follows a brilliant young girl who, at the beginning of the story, something happens to her parental figure, and I very much think that if you imagine the episode 7 plotline in season 2 of Arcane, where you're following a young, brilliant girl who has lost somebody she cares about, and she is now exploring that level of brilliance that she has, and she's allowed to explore that, what would that life look like? I kind of feel like of Jade and Dragons fits that to some degree, while still maintaining certain aspects from the, what I'll call, original timeline, with certain aspects of their character. And I really, really quite enjoyed the way that the steampunk elements of Jade and Dragons tied into the world building in a way that it just made everything feel unique and cool, and like anything was possible without feeling like Deus Ex Machina. Next up we have Engines of Empire. This is so much more epic fantasy, I would say, than Arcane, and I would say it has its foot a little bit more comfortably in the epic fantasy genre as a whole and all the things that come with that. However, to me, Engines of Empire feels like if you explored the Council of Arcane, and specifically the Council of Piltover, that's kind of who you're following in this story, except for the Council are all part of a family known as the Hawksburg Guild. There is this constant kind of push and pull between religion, which you, I think, explore a little bit more in season 2 of Arcane, but there is this push and pull between religion, technological advancements, magic, and politics, and how all those things come together. I do feel like there are some connections there. And then next up, this is one of the only ones where I'm like, the world is kind of cool, and it's somewhat similar, and that would be Senlin Ascends. This pretty much doesn't have, at least from the top of my head, any other additional parallels aside from the fact that the world is similar, but it follows a man who is looking for his missing wife, and he has to navigate this very odd, strange tower where it has steampunk elements. As I said at the beginning, if any of these piqued your interest, I'll have all of them linked in the description bar. Any additional reviews or discussions I've done, I'll have as well in case you want to hear more about them. I would love to see your recommendations, and I will be very curious to see if any of the things I mentioned were things that you ended up commenting as well. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope at least one of these is something that you end up enjoying. But like I said, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.